Welcome to the Microsoft IT Pro Podcast, a show about Office 365, Azure, and the IT Pro and end user side of life. Each week, we'll discuss a different topic or recent news related to Office 365 and Azure and how it relates to you as an IT Pro. The MS IT Pro Podcast is never longer than 30 minutes, so let's get started. We're back for another episode, Scott.
Time to get another one in. I think we're going to talk about some fun stuff today.
We are. I'm looking forward to it. It's something I recently kind of did a presentation on. I was up in Atlanta earlier this week. Got to talk at the SharePoint Office 365 user group up there and talked about some reporting in Office 365. But to do some of that reporting, I actually leveraged Azure Automation. So I could come up with a cloud-only solution to kind of doing a custom reporting solution. So today we figured, hey, we've been doing some Azure Automation stuff. Why not dive into Azure Automation?
Awesome. So we should probably start at the beginning. What is Azure Automation?
So Microsoft has their definition. They define it as a way for users to automate the manual, long-running, error-prone, and frequently repeated tasks that are commonly performed in cloud and enterprise environment. Saves time, reliability, all of that. That was an abbreviation of their long paragraph. My short version is it allows you to run PowerShell in Azure. So you can run PowerShell to automate things in Azure, Office 365, essentially whatever you can write PowerShell against, instead of having to have like a Windows 10 VM or a server VM to run the PowerShell on. It lets you just run it all right in Azure out in the cloud, so you don't have to spin up a VM to run some of that PowerShell. Again, some pros and cons to it, but in short, that's what it is. You can either write straight up PowerShell, or you can do PowerShell workflow, or they kind of have a graphical GUI presentation or presentation layer designer to allow you to write those workflows in more of a graphical drag and drop, almost Visio-ish, not really SharePoint designer type way, but more of a GUI interface than just writing straight PowerShell.
You kind of described Azure Automation as a little bit of like just a cron server or kind of a scheduler, right? So if I wanted to run PowerShell on a schedule, I could do that out of Windows Server and just schedule tasks and kind of go and do that thing. I think Azure Automation goes a little bit more beyond that. So you touched on a couple things there. So running things like PowerShell workflow, having the graphical designer for PowerShell workflow. But really, if you come from the on-prem land and you've ever used tooling like System Center, and particularly Orchestrator inside System Center, and the concept of runbooks and chaining, and putting all that good stuff together, you can I like to think of Azure Automation as System Center Orchestrator just running in the cloud. So Microsoft kind of took all that infrastructure behind it, and they gave me a way to run Orchestrator with way more stuff behind it, right? So I don't worry about the VMs that back it. I don't worry about any kind of worker roles or anything. It's all just figured out for me.
Yep, exactly. And like you said, it definitely goes way beyond just running that PowerShell. You have that concept of the runbooks, you can chain them, all kinds of stuff. So we'll dive into some of those details too about what else you can do, how it goes beyond just running PowerShell, different things that are there out of the box, what you can grab, what you can leverage that's already there. So you don't necessarily have to write a bunch of stuff.
Perfect. All right. So now that we know a little bit about kind of what it is and what its purpose is, how do we get up and running? So I assume we go into Azure, we say, hey, here's my subscription. I want to create an automation account. And then how do we get going after that?
Yep. So it's exactly that. You go into Azure, select that automation account, create it. And from there, you can actually jump right in and start writing stuff or grabbing existing ones. Within that Azure Automation account, you will have this concept of runbooks, like you had mentioned. And each runbook can be a different PowerShell script or a different PowerShell workflow, or again, one of those kind of graphical based workflows. And you can either start writing those on your own, or they also have a runbook gallery. So other people have written a bunch of runbooks. There's a bunch of them out there that are up in a gallery that you can actually grab and add into this Azure Automation account to start with the whole concept of your runbooks. And that's probably the first place you're going to want to start. You're going to want to have some runbooks. When you even create that Azure Automation account, you get a few sample runbooks automatically. I think there's 4 of them that are created. I can't remember what the 4 of them are off the top of my head because I just go in and delete them right away. But it does give you a good example of what a runbook would look like, both the graphical one and one that's just straight PowerShell code. So you have some place to start. You have something you can run, something you can look at without having to go out and write one yourself or grab one from that runbook gallery.
Gotcha. So just from a pure asset side of things, that's awesome. We can kind of go out, we can start slinging some PowerShell and working with it. But typically in PowerShell land, like you said, you're doing some reporting in SharePoint or you're coming from someplace else. Do we have the ability to work with modules from vendors or anything else that's out there? So if I have a SharePoint Online module, or maybe I'm working with something in Office 365, or heck, I want to do some like automation of my AWS resources from Azure. Can we do things like that, like load up modules into our runbooks and take advantage of those resources as well?
You can. So that's the other really cool thing about Azure Automation. If you have written some of that PowerShell before, like you said, written it against Exchange Online or SharePoint Online or any of those other technologies, and in PowerShell on your Windows 10 machine, you do the whole import, install module, and it goes out and looks at that PowerShell gallery that Microsoft has out there to grab a bunch of different modules, like the SharePoint PNP ones. We talked about those in one of our other podcasts. All the different Azure modules, any module from there, you can actually install into your runbook. So, or not into your runbook, but into your Azure Automation account. So in that Azure Automation account, you can click on under resources, there's a modules link. And from there, you can just browse the gallery and go out and search that entire gallery. So for instance, if I search for something like SharePoint, I don't know, there's probably 15 or 20 different modules that are returned. Again, all just pulling from that PowerShell gallery. There's stuff out there for VMs. So again, we're taking a little bit more of the Office 365 SharePoint side of things. But like you said, you can do it for virtual machines. You can do it for any of those modules you may be able to find out in that gallery that other people have written. In addition to that, you can also create your own modules. So maybe you've written some of your own custom modules that you use for your own applications, whether running in Azure or even running on-prem. And we'll get into a little bit more of that about how you can even access some on-prem resources. But you can bundle those modules up as a zip file, and there are some requirements around it. We can include a link to the show notes and, hey, this is what you need to include in that module if you're going to bundle it up. But you can then upload it to your Azure Automation account. So you can even add in your own custom modules if you've written them yourself or if they aren't out in the gallery. One of these examples, again, going back to the SharePoint Online world, is that the SharePoint Online module for Microsoft. If you've ever looked, it's not out there in that PowerShell gallery. It's still a downloadable MSI. You install it. But they have met all of the requirements in there to have it be an Azure Automation module. So once you've downloaded it, installed it on a Windows 10 machine, you can go out, browse through your Windows 10 file structure, find that PowerShell module in the file system, actually just grab that module, zip it up, and then upload it right into Azure Automation, and you can leverage all those SPO commandlets as well in Azure Automation. So even though they aren't necessarily out in that gallery, some of those other installable modules from Microsoft or others may still work to, again, install them, zip them up, and then add them to your Azure Automation runbook, or your Azure Automation account, rather.
And then I'm not limited to traditional modules either. So like you said, I can bring my own. We can also do things like desired state configuration as well, right? So if I want to bring a custom like X SharePoint resource in for DSC, we can go ahead and do all that stuff.
Yep. And I'll be honest, DSC in Azure Automation isn't something I've played with a ton yet, but you do. You have all that configuration where you can set up DSC nodes, DSC configuration, node configuration. So you can do all that DSC stuff as well in your Azure Automation.
Awesome. So I'd imagine it's got to give us some other things as well as we're going through and authoring these solutions. So if I think about trying to do some DevOps and kind of automating a decent scale, like IaaS environment, I'm going to need things like credentials, I might need shared variables across multiple runbooks so that I can have some kind of common settings and features, or maybe I want to like target different environments, right? My dev versus my QA versus my prod. So do we have any flexibility there, or how do we go about kind of getting that integrity or those shared resources across everything?
Yeah, absolutely. Again, within that Azure Automation account, you do have that concept of some of these shared resources that can be shared across all of your runbooks within that Azure Automation account. So modules, again, was one of those shared resources. The other ones you asked about were things like credentials or some variables. So you can actually go in and add credentials right into that Azure Automation account. So maybe you want to connect to a SQL server within your PowerShell script, or maybe you want to go out and connect to SharePoint Online or Exchange Online, or you need to use a different set of credentials to access a resource in Azure. You can go into those shared resources, go into your credentials, and add a username and password right in there. Type it in, save it. The password's all encrypted. It's a secure string, so nobody can go in here and just open up credentials and see the credentials. But then as you write your runbooks, you can actually call that credential variable, pull in the username and password, and use it to connect to whatever resources you need. So for instance, when I was doing something like reporting, I had my SharePoint Online credentials, I had some SQL Server credentials, stored them as two separate credentials, and then when I need to connect to SharePoint Online or connect to a SQL Server, I just pull in those credentials, essentially save them in a variable, and use that variable then when I go out to connect. And that's different than the shared variables. So you also have this concept of shared variables. Maybe it's a connection string, like you said, to different environments. You can also create shared variables within your Azure Automation account. So they have a few different types of variables available. They have strings, integers, date times, Boolean, and null. You can create shared variables just like you can credentials. So now as you're writing your runbooks, maybe you need access to that connection string in several different places. Maybe you want to store a URL for a SharePoint Online site or for your SharePoint admin site in a variable. Go ahead, create variables, type in whatever you need to in that variable, and then you can access it from any of those runbooks. Use that variable from any runbook in your Azure Automation account. Even within your runbooks, as you're running through that PowerShell script, you can even create new variables, new credentials, set them, change them. So this isn't necessarily even something that you have to set at the outset and you kind of set it outside of your runbooks. You can interact with these beyond just getting that information as you run through those various runbooks.
Awesome. I think one of the other big asset types that we've got out there as well, and kind of typically important, is you can do certificate assets. So if you're working with websites, or even if you're doing any kind of certificate-based authentication, there's a kind of secure store sitting out there for those certs, and kind of common tooling and ways to go ahead and leverage that in there. So we've got a runbook. We went ahead and created it. We wrote some PowerShell. We did some stuff. Maybe we had some modules and we used some variables and some credentials and things like that. What does running it look like outside of execution on demand?
So there's a whole bunch of different ways you can trigger these to run once you have a runbook created. Before we actually dive into this, we've been going for about 15 minutes, so let's take a quick pause. Again, hear from BitWizards, awesome sponsor. Big thanks to them. So a quick message from them, and then we're going to jump into how you actually run these runbooks.
You love technology, so do we. You're an experienced IT pro. We respect that. You're a problem solver. We've got clients. You need a tan. We've got a beach. You love Azure. We love Azure. At BitWizards, we've won Florida Trend Magazine's Best Companies to Work For 8 years running and have been a Microsoft Gold partner since 2001. I don't know about you, but it sounds to me like we were meant for each other. Go to bitwizards.com/cloudsmith to introduce yourself.
All right, so we're back. Let's dive back into running runbooks. So like you said, you've gotten it all written, or you've gone out and grabbed one of the runbooks from the gallery that you want to use. And now, how do you go out and run these things? There's some on-demand methods, there's some other ones. So the first method is if you're writing this, you don't know that it's necessarily ready for prime time yet, you want to test it out. There is a test pane option. So this test pane option essentially opens up kind of like a PowerShell console where you can go in and just run your runbook. Be aware this, while it is called a test pane, it is actually running the PowerShell. So this isn't like it's going to simulate how it runs and not actually make changes. This is just like running PowerShell on your Windows machine where it's going to actually run the PowerShell. But this runbook isn't necessarily published yet, available to schedule, which we'll get into, or run it from some of the other options. It's just a test pane. It allows you to quickly click run. If you're writing some outputs or you're getting some errors back, you'll see it that way.
So not a what if.
Yeah, not a what if. It's just interactive mode to test it all out. So once you've tested it all out, publish it, and now you can start the runbook. So there's just a normal run button. This is that on demand, like you said. You click run, it runs the runbook. You can see the output, all of that. Again, it's nice, but it's not super powerful. Some of the other ways are where you can really leverage these runbooks and get some advantages from them. So one option, probably one of the easiest ways to start a runbook, is you can set up schedules. So another one of those shared resources you can have when you get into Azure Automation is a schedule. This could be daily, hourly, minutes, weekly, monthly. You go in and you can create these schedules as shared resources, and then you can tie these schedules to your runbooks. So maybe I need to make some updates once a day, or maybe I'm polling a SharePoint list to say, hey, once somebody adds something to this list, grab that list item, go do something. You just set up that schedule. Azure Automation will go in, trigger this runbook on that set schedule, add it to the queue, and run it. Again, that's nice. It can be very helpful. There's even some other ways. So you can call these runbooks via PowerShell or an API. So if you're writing some custom code, a custom app, you want to call it, or you have some other PowerShell or even another runbook that you want to call a different runbook from, you can reach into Azure Automation, trigger a runbook based on some custom code you've written or some other PowerShell. Another way is Azure Alerts. So Azure has these Azure Alerts. You can even set Azure Alerts to call your runbook, start a runbook, go run a process when some alert gets triggered. And then kind of the final big way is with webhooks. And we'll put a link on how you can do this with webhooks, but you can tie webhooks into Azure Automation. So call a runbook, start running a runbook, leveraging webhooks in Azure Automation. So again, lots of flexibility when you call these things and how you want to start them. Makes them really powerful if there's this PowerShell you need to run based on certain conditions. Even if you go look in the gallery for runbooks people have already created, they've done some cool ones. So if you add an item to a SharePoint list, maybe go provision OneDrive for Business, or use this as your SharePoint Online provisioning. Leverage those PNP provisioning commandlets we talked about earlier. Create a nice little list, a form in SharePoint Online. Let users fill it out, go through some approval workflow, and then call a runbook or several runbooks within Azure Automation to go spin up those SharePoint Online sites, leveraging some of those PNP provisioning commandlets. So really cool. Lots of things you can do.
All right. I think one of the things that people might have a question about too is, so I've set all this stuff up. I have an automation account. Is there any concept of scaling or memory management? Kind of what are my limitations, right? So if I'm enumerating a bunch of objects in a big for loop and it's going to process, and I know it's going to process for 5 hours on my big beefy VM on-prem, how do I translate that into automation land and figure out what that's going to look like?
You mean kind of like that error I was experiencing the other day and you found the solution for?
Yeah, leading question, but continue.
No, so Microsoft does have this concept. It's prepare yourselves. It's a really unique name so that nobody hogs a bunch of resources. The name of it is called Fair Share. So they only let you take your fair share of resources as you're running these runbooks. If you look at the documentation and some of the things I've experienced, I've seen some things that happen that don't necessarily line up with fair share. I'm still playing with this with some really large runbooks that run for a long time. But Microsoft's documentation says that in order to allow the resources that runbooks consume to share them with everybody, if you have a job that's been running for more than 3 hours, it will actually unload your job and reload it, which means if you don't take proper precautions, which we'll talk about here in a second, it will just start that runbook over from the beginning and it'll start running again. So if you have a 5-6 hour runbook, you'll just continue to run the first 3 hours of it over and over and over and over again. I think after 3 times, it'll fail out. I have gotten some runbooks to run for 3 hours. I've had others fail out after like 10 or 15 minutes. And it's not even like I've changed them. It's the exact same runbook. So it's not even like there's some other resource limitations I'm hitting. I don't know exactly how this works in the background. I tried to figure it out to say, okay, I have this exact same runbook. I'm not changing anything. I'm not calling anything different. I'm just running the same one. Sometimes it fails after 15 minutes. Sometimes it fails after a couple hours. But that is something to be aware of, that if you don't take that into account for these long-running workbooks, they won't necessarily always complete. So to get around that, if you've written PowerShell workflow before, there's this concept of checkpoints. So you can add checkpoints at various places within your PowerShell workflow that essentially say, hey, once I hit this point, go save the current state of this PowerShell workflow. Save my variables, output generated up to that point. That whole state of that workflow, save it out there. And then when it unloads and restarts, it can pull that state in and restart from that last checkpoint. It sounds simple. This can be kind of tricky when you actually get into it because you have to make sure you put checkpoints at the right place. For instance, there might be certain PowerShell you don't want to run twice within a workbook. So you have to make sure you put checkpoints after that and that you'll get to that checkpoint before you restart. Another one I found is if you're going out and using those credentials to connect to something such as SharePoint Online, if you restart from a checkpoint, that credential and that token and the key, everything that was used to connect to that external resource does not get saved as that checkpoint. Every time I've had to restart and jump back to a checkpoint, the very first thing I've had to do is go reconnect to all of those SharePoint Online, reconnect my SharePoint PnP commandlets, make those connections again, because those connections don't seem to stay valid within that checkpoint. So when you restore from it, it can't connect. You get errors about trying to connect.
Yeah, I think you're learning a little bit about defensive programming, right?
Yeah. Exactly.
And kind of how to backfill on some of that stuff. So, but to leverage those features, you do have to be using PowerShell workflow, correct? That's not just a native PowerShell thing. You've got to go that next step and kind of get into workflow land. And I think that speaks to maybe not all workloads would be appropriate for automation. So you might need to mix and match a little bit. There might be some like HPC features you need. Like maybe you do need some high performance compute, and maybe you want to do something with Azure Batch. So runbooks over here that call Azure Batch, or maybe you want to do something inside an Azure function, right? So having that webhook, maybe it calls an Azure function, which does some processing, which then goes and kicks off your runbook. So you can absolutely kind of chain things together and build it up to where you need it to be. So we've talked about running resources against like VMs that are stored in Azure, SharePoint Online. I think one of the other really cool things is you can connect to on-premises resources as well. So similar to a couple of other things that use kind of the zero firewall punch service bus relays, there's this concept of hybrid workers or hybrid worker roles. So you can have runbooks that execute in Azure Automation that go ahead and execute against on-premises agents and go ahead and run things up. So you can kind of mix and match there. That leverages OMS and a couple other things. I think one of the other things to talk about kind of when we talked about scale too, do you want to touch on pricing real quick and then we'll close it out?
Yeah. So this is another thing that I really like about Azure Runbooks. Pricing for Azure Automation is dirt cheap from my perspective. So you only have two pricing levels when you get into Azure Automation. You have the free tier, which gives you 500 minutes of running PowerShell, running Azure Automation, running runbooks, however you want to phrase that, a month. So you can run up to 500 minutes. Once you run out, you can't run anymore until the next month. The next level to bump up to is you just pay per minute. And the cost per minute on the next level, if you need more than 500 minutes, is 0.2 cents per minute.
A lot cheaper than SCCM or Orchestrator or anything like that.
Yeah, exactly. Or like one solution I was like, we can spin up some Windows VMs and run PowerShell on Windows VMs in Azure if you don't have an on-premises environment. Again, significantly cheaper than that. I think I figured I have one runbook I'm working on that I calculated may run up to 30 hours. I calculated it all out. I think 30 hours of a running runbook comes out, if you only run it once a month, comes out to like $15 a month.
So definitely some opportunities for getting some kind of operational buyback there, right? So now we're getting cost efficiency and some other things by adopting some of that tooling that might be better at the job.
Yes, absolutely. So again, if you're on Office 365 and you run some PowerShell, go look at this. Even if you don't run Office 365, you have a lot of PowerShell scripts that you like to automate things with, whether it's on-prem or whether it's in the cloud, because like we said, you can do both. Go look at Azure Automation. It's not applicable for all things, all scenarios, like Scott said, but it is definitely a very powerful tool that's out there in Azure that you should take a look at and leverage if you can.
Perfect. Well, I think that takes us to time, so let's go ahead and close it out.
All right. Thanks a lot, Scott. Another great episode, and we will talk to you next week.
Thanks, Ben.
Yep. If you enjoyed the podcast, go leave us a 5-star rating in iTunes. It helps to get the word out so more IT pros can learn about Office 365 and Azure. If you have any questions you want us to address on the show or feedback about the show, feel free to reach out via our website, Twitter, or Facebook. Thanks again for listening and have a great day.